All right, so today we are going to be looking at the end of the Roman Republic since we didn't finish it last time, and the Empire, and we'll see if we get through where I want to with that or if we'll pick that up in the next lecture. So where we left off was the end of the Punic Wars and the consequences of the Punic Wars. And those things were significant changes to Rome as a whole. So let's do this as after the Punic Wars. And right, just as a refresher for that, if we look at the consequences, I'm not going to go into the details of that since I covered that in the last lecture, but just as a refresher, the consequences of the Punic War and the changes of that were that you had an increase in land, in wealth, in slaves, in the changes for women. Right, so those are what we looked at. If you don't remember that, make sure to go check out the last lecture. At the very end, we covered those in a lot more detail. So those were the consequences. However, there's more things that happened after the Punic Wars and just a fundamental shift in Rome and its kind of identity in of itself. And that has to do with those consequences, which is why I wanted to put them back on there for just a minute, because you have to remember those consequences to understand why Rome has this significant change, this shift from the early republic to the later republic. And there really is a difference in it, if you're saying what are the main characteristics or qualities of the Roman Republic, the early republic pre-Punic Wars is a very different place from the Roman Republic, the later Roman Republic post-Punic Wars. So they were an incredibly important event that really shaped and transformed the Roman Republic. And in that part, that is because of that wealth and increase in changes to women, the influx of slaves, and a significant mass of land. The whole concept of Rome, the Roman identity that was part of the main themes of the myths that we talked about, where they were a soldier farmer, the idea of duty to Rome before oneself, sacrifice for the good of Rome. Those themes or those values didn't go away, but in practice, they weren't happening in the same way. So you saw those ideals actually enacted out in many ways, not in everything, but in many ways in the early Roman Republic. In the latter period, those ideals from those myths that we looked at just weren't there. And in part, you have a new focus on individualism and looking at what can be accomplished for a person for themselves over for the good of Rome. There is a huge shift too in the idea of, we'll say, making money and looking to use the Senate position or government position in order to enrich oneself. They had a lot of discussion about that. There was also this massive shift in, well, we could put it under, well, it's not about making money though, but it is about the wealth. The what's called indulgence of the wealthy. Of course, the poor in Rome were not participating in this. The individualism, yes, the making money and being part of the government, and the indulgence of the wealthy, or indulgence, that was definitely the wealthy. But you have this new emphasis on luxury and displaying that through clothing, the house, stuff you purchase. They the best example, and I think I mentioned this when I was talking about the wealth, but it is an important one. The best example of this is the dinner parties, though, and how they had these massive, extreme dinner parties that would go on for 4 to 6 hours, sometimes even longer. And it would be massive amounts of food. The more exotic, the better. And so they would have slaves search out whatever delicacies and weird oddities that they could find to eat. And then the idea is that it was rude to stop eating. And so what they would do in order to continue eating is that they would make themselves throw up. They would take a feather and you'd stick it at the back of your throat until you threw up, and then that way you could continue, so that you could continue eating. But I mean, the idea of how much waste and indulgence that you are intentionally throwing up your food just so you can eat more is the best example of that indulgence that took place. And you had now people who were new to wealth, because remember, there was the new class now that had emerged out of that, the equestrian class. And so you had people that were flaunting, and the patricians as well. This wasn't just the equestrian class flaunting, but you had a much larger population of people now flaunting that wealth, wearing super expensive clothing, lots of jewelry, decking out their homes in just ostentatious ways. And then the dinner parties, I think, are just that quintessential example of that indulgence. And that remember, their kind of a line that they, or what was meant to be a slander towards them back in the day in the early Republic, that they embraced with pride as a good thing, was that they were called porridge eaters. And it was meant to be an insult to that they were too poor or uneducated, unenlightened to eat finer things, that they just stuck to porridge. And that in the early Republic, that was seen as a sense of pride. The idea that you weren't overindulgent, that they were focused, that their goal and emphasis was to the greater good of Rome over themselves. And that wealth and change that took place significantly changed that. The other thing that it changed was that it reignited class warfare. Remember, we talked about how the patricians and the plebeians had always had this fighting that took place between them at the very start of the Republic, and that led to some political changes in government when the plebeians realized that they could just say, like, screw you, we're not going to fight. What are you going to do about it? We're the entire army. And the patricians were like, crap. Okay, yeah, here's some concessions. Please accept that and stop there. And then they're like, oh, okay, we're good. But I mean, they weren't, but it was a Band-Aid on this class struggle and class warfare. And the increase in wealth and land reignited it. And one of the biggest ways that this came up was that the soldiers that fought in the Punic War were hoping to end up getting some of that land for themselves. Understandably, they're the ones that sacrificed and fought in the war. And what ended up happening is that wealthy senators, so patricians, because only patricians could still be senators, but specifically there were some wealthy patricians that weren't senators, but what I think was more biting towards this problem and caused issues was that it was senators that were doing it as well. And again, there's that individualism and making money kind of thing. So what wealthy patricians, and a lot of them being senators, bought up large tracts of land. And I'm talking significantly large tracts of land. Thousands of acres of land. So, not, I bought 20 acres. They also, of course, bought the land closest to Rome, which would be the most desirable. So then when the regular common soldiers came back, they're like, what land are we getting? We fought for this. And the senators are like, oh, yeah, don't worry, we didn't forget you. We gave you land, like 50 miles away. They're like, wait, what? Oh, 50, 100 miles away. Don't worry, it's over there. That's close. And they're like, no, no, it's not. And that's not where we want the land. And so there started to be massive tensions between this, not just the soldiers, but the plebeians who felt like they were missing out on this land and wealth that had come from the Punic Wars, and the soldiers specifically feeling like they were getting shafted because the senators were purchasing up thousands and thousands of acres of land for themselves. This has a fundamental, a separate consequence, again, which I mentioned to a degree, but I want to re-emphasize with that. We'll just attach it to here, is that this began the process of plantation farming for food, right? This was a combination of land and slaves from the Punic War. It needed both. But now that they had these massive, because obviously, what were the senators doing with thousands and thousands of acres of land? They were converting them into massive food plantations, using the slave labor that was in insane abundance from all of this conquering. Slaves, so it's really interesting. The whole concept of slavery in Rome had a really varied component to it. The slaves came from whoever they captured. So they had Greek slaves that were there to educate their children. I don't remember if I mentioned this one either, but they hated Greek culture. Greek people. Sorry. They hated Greek people, but they loved Greek culture, right? That was the whole point of Aeneas being from Troy rather than from Greece. And so then they constantly pissed on the Greeks and like how horrible of a people they were. And then they're like, but we need them to educate our children. And in fact, through the Roman Republic, wealthy Romans spoke Greek. Latin was seen as a vernacular language. It was one for the poor, right? Oh, that common Latin. Oh, how uneducated and unintelligent you are. Those who are educated and refined speak Greek. And they did. And it was only about the time of Octavian, who becomes Augustus. So at the turning towards the empire, that Latin became the main language and acceptable and seen as superior, or at least the language to speak, that you didn't need to learn Greek. Octavian knew Greek, but not fluently. But his predecessors did, because they were educated by Greek slaves, and they were always attached to the Greek culture in Rome. But then you also had slaves that were soldiers that were captured from the Punic Wars. You had women and children that were captured from towns that they conquered, and it didn't matter where or whatever. And this is how slavery in most of the world went. The U.S. is the one that went off and made it a race-based slavery of a specific group of people. Throughout the world, and not that slavery is good in any situation, but they were unique in narrowing it to a very specific group of people and making it a racial component, where in most of the world it was, if we conquer you, you're slave. And you could also sell yourself into slavery as a Roman citizen. There were Roman citizens who, usually debt slavery is what it was. You went in so far into debt, you're like, I can't get out of this, rather than having it become a problem for my wife and child. And usually were the men that they'd sell themselves into slavery with a contract that money of their debt would be paid by the person that they were selling their self into slavery. And it was more like indentured servanthood, because you had a time or term limit. Usually it wasn't for life. I suppose if your debt was great enough, it could end up being for life. But most of the time, it was a time period you served, and then you were free again, and your debt was cleared. And ideally, you could, start over, essentially. But how slaves were treated varied. There were house slaves, and some who were personal slaves that were treated really well. There were other personal house slaves, especially women, who were sex slaves, and that's what they were, and had no choice in the matter of that. You had other slaves who you weren't supposed to kill your slaves, but it did happen. But there were rules against some types of beatings and death. murder of slaves. But again, that varied. If you were a gladiator later on in the empire, you were often a slave. And obviously death didn't count then if it was in the gladiator ring. And then you had some slaves who could earn money on the side and became extremely wealthy, and then were able to purchase their own freedom and go on to become very wealthy individuals. I mean, so it's this huge variant of how slaves were treated, the conditions that they lived in. But what tended to be consistent is that slaves that were on these plantation farms had a horribly short life. They were treated poorly. The labor was insanely difficult, and they were just thrown away because of this massive influx in wealth. They were seen as disposable, and that they could simply cheaply be replaced. This will become a problem when we look at the decline and downfall of at least the Western Roman Empire. Again, we talked about Western, Eastern. There's a difference, and that's going to transition into the Byzantine world. So I'm not talking about the Byzantine world part of it and the downfall of the Byzantine Empire that was part of the Roman world. But the Western decline happened. There's lots of reasons, and we're going to look at that. But one of the reasons we're going to examine has to do with the decline of this massive influx of slaves, where they no longer could get slaves to farm the plantation, at least not cheaply. And then that coincides with less production in food. And the problem was these plantation farms became the main mode to feed Rome. And as they become fully dependent upon this plantation style, when you have things like that go wrong that really don't have a way to fix, you have a significant problem in feeding the population. And so that's going to be a longer term consequence down the road. So we will come back to that, I guess, as a long-term consequence of the Punic Wars. We're looking more at short term. Nonetheless, I think it's an important one to remember because we are going to come back to it. So you have this class warfare. Wealthy patricians buying up this land to make plantation-based farming. The soldiers feeling shafted from the whole thing. And so there starts to be some pushback, which comes in with two tribunes that were brothers. And they were the Gracchi brothers. And we'll just put it here. Their names were Tiberius and Gaius. And both of them at different times pushed for reform, where they argued for land reform. Specifically, initially Tiberius, who suggested that it should only be limited to 300 acres per citizen and 150 acres per each child in the family, which still seems like a lot of acreage, but of course that threatened the economic independent wealth gaining of these wealthy patricians who were making a fortune on these plantation farming styles. And then what they argued is that this is land specifically gained from the Punic Wars, right? They said, no, it shouldn't be going like thousands and thousands of acres. It should be split into this. And then they said the remaining land after that should go to the poor and soldiers in small acre plots, 15-acre plots. To poor and soldiers in 15-acre plots. And this definitely was reminiscent of that farmer-soldier ideal, right? That the soldiers wanted their own small farm that they could farm and self-sustain. They didn't like it. Tiberius ends up being killed by senators. And then Gaius takes up the mantle as tribune and continues to push for reform, and says that the state the Roman Republic, right, should have public warehouses to store grain, and this grain would be collected from public land, which would include the land that was bought from the Punic Wars, and that the senators, some of them who were totally using public land for their own benefit. So this was a combination of saying, you know, the land that was given to people by the state from Punic Wars, but then also public land, and that was a part of the huge problem, is there were totally senators who were squatting. I mean, I guess they weren't probably physically there, but the people representing them were squatting on public land and using it. And she said, yeah, you need to have, if you're going to cultivate the public land, then you need to at least give a percentage of the grain to the state. And then from that, it would be given monthly to people, ideally the lower classes, below market rate. He also argued for that soldiers should have military clothing provided for them. So how it worked as a soldier, there was some potential to become wealthy as a soldier, especially if you were an officer. But the thing is that most of the people that made a lot of money from war were already the patricians. You, as a soldier, had to provide your own military equipment, clothing, food. Gosh, the Roman military, while one of the most well-defined ones, it was one of the best militaries at the time. You literally, as a common soldier, had to pay for everything. There were fees for all these ridiculous things. Plus, you had to provide everything for yourself, and it could get costly. Some did it just because it was a job and it was better than nothing. Others did it so that they could get Roman citizenship. One of the ways that you could obtain Roman citizenship was to serve as a soldier. And then also he argued for giving citizenship, Roman citizenship, in full to those that were in the Italian provinces. So this is what he argued for, and Gaius was chased into the mountains to hide from senators plotting to murder him. What this proved with this class warfare aspect is, and showcased to people, is that senators, right, these wealthy patricians, were willing to murder people, and intimidate, because they intimidated some and intimidated others. So if you were lucky enough not to be on the murder hit list, you could still get beat and intimidated in order to protect their own interest and their own wealth. And this just further kind of created this divide between the patricians and the plebeians. It also created, I mean, this is that corruption, right? They're definitely not putting Rome before themselves or sacrificing for the good of Rome anymore. And this became kind of a rallying cry in Rome, that Rome wasn't like it used to be. Rome used to be, well, it was the good old days. Rome back in the day was this amazing place where Romans cared about the Republic and put Rome before themselves. Now we have Romans who are only looking out for their self-interest and indulge in all of that. And I mean, and to an extent, they were right. Rome was never the golden age that they kind of made it out to be, because the early Republic had its own set of problems and constant warfare. nonetheless, there was a significant shift in individualism and a lack of putting Rome before themselves. And many seen Rome as becoming not only corrupt, but lacking any piety anymore in the process. So one of the primary sources that I had you look at was Marcus Cato the Elder. This is written by Plutarch and is kind of a biography of Marcus Cato the Elder. But one of the things it does really well in highlighting is basically saying like, look, this is what we used to be. And so he's listing all of Marcus Cato's the Elder's good qualities, and it were all the things that were ideal to the early Roman Republic, and it was definitely all the things that people began to point out that they wished for again as Rome changed. So it's important to kind of get an idea of this is what the Romans saw as the ideal Roman man. Maybe not in everything. He does get criticized for being too stingy. So there is obviously this level of frugalness, but stinginess, that's bad. Frugalness, good. Stingy, not so good. But for the most part, what the excerpts we're going to be looking at showcase these ideals of here's an ideal Roman man. This is what people are supposed to be. These are the virtues and values we have lost as the Roman Republic has expanded. So I already kind of highlighted some, just because it's longer, I wanted to make sure I could find the points easy. The first one's right off the bat, right? He gained in early life a good habit of body by working with his own hands and living temperately and serving in war, and seemed to have an equal proportion of health and strength. So you have, right, several things listed first. Working the body, being healthy, living temperately, right? Not being too excessive, and serving in the war, right? There's that soldier farmer, and health and strength kind of goes with that as well. And then a little bit later it says, nor did he merely abstain from taking fees for his counsel. He was a lawyer too, and pleading, but did not even seem to put any high price on the honor which proceeded from such kind of combat, seeming much more desirous to signalize himself in the camp and in real fights, and while yet but a youth, had his breast covered with scars he had received from the enemy, being, as he himself says, but 17 years old when he made his first campaign, in the time when Hannibal, which is during the Punic Wars, in the height of his success, was burning and pillaging Italy. Right, so here we have a soldier again, and that instead of boasting about his success as and not charging people for his counsel, or arguments as a lawyer, he put more emphasis and importance on his time that he was a soldier, and has the scars to prove it, right? So that's seen as this boon to that. Then a little bit down you have, it's talking about this person that had lands bordering Cato's. Nor could he but admire, when he understood from his servants the manner of his living, how he labored with his own hands. There's one. He labored with his own hands at his estate, a farmer. Went on foot betimes in the morning to the courts to assist those who wanted his counsel. How returning home again when it was winter, he would throw a loose frock over his shoulders, and in the summertime would work without anything on among his domestics, sit down with them, eat the same bread, and drink the same wine. When they spoke also of other good qualities, his fair dealing in moderation. So, I mean, this is kind of 2, maybe 3, but the idea of frugal, it's that whole porridge eater thing, right? He's not being indulgent. In fact, he's eating the same things as his slaves. Now, Marcus Cato the Elder was super stingy and a bastard, but that's a separate thing on an interpretation from today of looking at it. They saw him as a quality person, and he did have some good characteristics, but he was a total bastard to his slaves. And even later Plutarch kind of goes, maybe that was a little bit too far. One of the things it talks about in the longer excerpt is that he sold his slaves off for sex, in 2 parts. 1, if someone came to his house and wanted to have sex with one of his slaves, he'd charge him for it. 2, if the slaves themselves wanted to have a relationship with each other, he'd charge them for it. And then he was kind of like, that seems a little excessive. But he was a bastard to his slaves. Nonetheless, there were other good qualities for it, and the Romans saw him as this epitome of the ideal Roman man in these different ways. Then in another one it says, for being sent together with him is... So then there's this another part where he is going into the position of treasurer for the Roman military, and as for being sent together with him as treasurer, when he saw him according to his natural custom make great expenses and distribute among... So saw him to his natural custom. This is not Cato. This is the other guy. Let's see, other guy. He's treasurer, and he's going to inspect the spending. And this other guy, he sees him make great expenses and distribute among the soldiers without sparing. He freely told him that the expense in itself was not the greatest thing to be considered, but that he was corrupting the ancient frugality of the soldier. Look, they're even using that word of frugalness, right? Giving the means to abandon themselves to unnecessary pleasures and luxuries. Scipio, that's the other guy, answered that he had no need for an accurate treasure, bearing it on that he was, so to say, full sail to the war, and that he owed the people an account of his actions and not of the money spent. So then Cato returns from Sicily, and together with Fabius makes loud complaints in the open senate of Scipio's lavishing unspeakable sums. Here, we'll put the other guy. Boop. And together with Fabius made loud complaints in the open senate of Scipio's lavish unspeakable sums and childishly loitering away his time in wrestling matches, comedies, as if he were not to make war but holiday, and thus succeeded in getting some of the tribunes of the people sent to call him back to Rome, in case these accusations prove true. But Scipio, demonstrating, as it were, to them by his preparations the coming victory, and being found merely to be living pleasantly with his friends, that there was nothing else to do, but in no respect because of the easiness of the moment and stuff. So the idea with this is, right, is not only does he then say, like, look, it's not so much the money, although that could be a problem. It's more that you're threatening the ancient frugality of soldiers and having them live this luxurious way through pleasure. And then goes back to the Senate and complains, so they bring him back to answer those charges. But it is important that then what this is saying here is the Senate didn't hold them accountable. Not them, Scipio. Right? That they didn't hold him accountable for that. And then it says he grew more and more powerful through his years for orator. So then here we go. Oratorical skills, so good speaking skills, an accomplishment commonly studied and sought after by all young men. But he was very rare who could cultivate the old habits of bodily labor or prefer a light supper. That's 3, frugal again, and a breakfast which never saw the fire. So that means it's like what we do now with cereal. He didn't cook his own breakfast. He ate a breakfast that didn't require cooking, is basically what that meant. Or be in love with poor clothes. 4, right, that he didn't have to wear lavish clothing and he had a homely lodging, or could set his ambition rather on doing without luxuries than possessing his own, right? So there's a whole list of things that were seen as good qualities as well. With reason, therefore, everybody admired Cato. When they saw others sink under labors and grow effeminate by pleasures, right, that's that overindulgence, and yet beheld him unconquered by either. And so a strong worker too. It's both of those. You have strong worker and we'll just use the word frugal again, but right, didn't overindulge, and yet beheld him unconquered by either, and that not only when he was young and desirous of honor, but also when old. So then it's saying, right, not only when he was young, where you're like motivated to do these things so you can move up in status, but even when he was old and wealthy, he still stuck to these. And that was seen as impressive too. Like, you didn't go soft in your old age and then start being like living it up. Like some famous victor in the games. I think those it goes on, but I think that's a good sampling of it. that this idea of just how he lived his life, the idea, and I think it's important for this, right? I mean, for his general temperance, however, and self-control, he really deserves the highest admiration. For when he commanded the army, he never took for himself and those that belonged to him above 3 bushels of wheat for a month, and somewhat less than 1.5 bushels a day, or barley for his baggage cattle. And when he entered upon the government of Sardinia, where his predecessors had been used to require tents, bedding, and clothes upon the public account, and to charge the state heavily with the cost of provisions and entertainments for a great train of servants and friends, the difference he showed in his economy was something incredible. There was nothing of any sort for which he put to the public expense. Oops, too far. Let's try that arrow again. So this is again sacrifice for the good of Rome, and all the soldier stuff was also duty to Rome. Right, he would walk without a carriage to visit the cities, with one of the common town officers who carried his dress and a cup to offer libation. And yet, though he seemed thus easy and sparing to all who were under his power, he on the other hand showed most inflexible severity and strictness in related to public justice, and was rigorous and precise in what concerned the ordinance of the commonwealth, so that the Roman government never seemed more terrible nor yet more mild under his administration. So this is justice, which we'll see as part of, when we look at the Res Gestae, the golden shield and the ideals of the Roman man. That's going to put in there too. Okay, so that'll be the last one. But this idea, right, of everyone else, and the key with this, in each of these circumstances, but this is a good one here, it's always comparing him to everyone else. Right, the idea that, look at what Rome has become. This is what Scipio and the other people and how they would act and what they're doing. But no, Cato is behaving this way. So that's what makes it unique. It's not just that he has admirable skills that everyone was doing, although I suppose it might not be as admirable if everyone's participating in it. But the idea that it's definitely comparing the idea that Rome has become this lavish, overindulgent, selfish thing. But Cato has still put Rome first, has still focused on they're really focused on his body and parts of this too, but he's keeping his strength up. He's working with his own hands. He's modest. He's frugal. So it like I said, it's really a good example of that dichotomy and somewhat tension that Rome had with themselves, of what Rome had become, but what they kind of longed Rome to still be. And this will get readdressed when we look at Augustus, because it does come back up. Octavian / Augustus brings it back up and says, that we're going to address these corruptions and issues. In fact, it's even going to come up before that in a way, with the first civil wars, with the saving the republic. So from these tensions, from these class tensions that emerge, as well as the increased interest in somewhat self improvement and wealth, you end up with a series of civil wars. The first civil war is between Marius and Sulla. But it also reflects class tensions in it as well. And so, okay, well, let's put the important things with this. 1, it shows class tensions. 2, it's going to change the nature of soldiers. And 3, it's going to set the scene, let's go with scene for Julius Caesar with the triumvirates. And we're going to talk about that. but it allows what comes out of the war between Marius and Sulla is that Caesar's going to recognize what he can do to guarantee control of Rome. And so those are the consequences from it. I guess I should have put that under a header there, so we'll make sure that's clear. The consequences and changes. What happens with this is that essentially it becomes an argument between the Council of Plebes and the Senate. So what happened is that generals, senators, wealthy patricians wanted to be assigned military I don't know, like, what would be the best word for that? Military appointments? That would probably be it. Where they're given by the Senate or the Council of Plebes, go conquer Gaul. You know, you get to be general of that. Because military appointments brought wealth and prestige. You could make a ton of money. Again, if you're wealthy, especially if you were the general, because there's looting, and then there's gaining of land and territory, and then you get to come back and have a party and a festival for your success, and that raises your honor and status and gives you more power in the Senate, which then can increase your wealth. So these generals and these senators who were generals as well, patricians, all wanted these appointments. And what happens with this is that Sulla was given appointment by the Senate, and Marius was given, they didn't just give it to him. The Council of Plebes overrode the Senate, which they had the right to do, and gave Marius the appointment. And this was done because the patrician or the plebeians hated Sulla. Sulla was a jerk to non-patricians. A horrible person to non-patricians. He saw the poor as disgusting. In fact, a lot of wealthy Romans did. If you were going to like put it in context, I mean, it really was like, ew. That's how they looked at the poor. It was like, ugh. Move on, you plebeian, you get out of my sight, don't taint my greatness with your nastiness. They didn't treat him well. And this will be an important tip when we come back and talk about Christianity and why it grew in Rome. One of the reasons had to do with that treatment of the poor. The wealthy Romans were jerks to the poor. You were lucky if they just ignored you. And consequently, the plebeians didn't like Sulla, and so they granted it to Marius, and this was not just an appointment, but also consulship, so leading Rome and stuff that way. Well, Sulla gets pissed. Not surprisingly, and he goes on a tirade. So here, let's put this. It gives this. Sulla gets upset and rejects the Council of Plebes, and says what he says is that it was not legal. And he just basically went on a tirade of, you can't do that, how dare you, that's not fair, I was elected first by the Senate, and, you know, that kind of thing. And he stormed off, and Marius takes over. But then he raises his army, and is going to end up marching on Rome. So Sulla raises an army and marches on Rome. This is the first time that a Roman army marched on Rome. Now, what happens from this is they go back and forth. Like Marius wins, Sulla wins. Eventually, Sulla, let's put it as 5 here. So again, there is back and forth. They each get their victories in and kick the other out. The end winner is Sulla, who in 83 BCE becomes dictator. Remember that part of the government, you could elect a dictator for 6 months. It was supposed to only be for 6 months, but they elect him dictator in order to what they called what he set up and then was called by the Senate, reconstitute the republic. He claimed that he was the savior of Rome. This will be a common theme that shows up where both him, Julius Caesar, and Octavian all claim that they're the saviors of Rome, that Rome was being destroyed, and they're the savior. He restores the power of the Senate, because the Senate did have some increasing weakness that had been emerging as the Council of Plebes and others came in and became more powerful. He did get rid of the opposition, which means murder. So he ended up killing a lot of Roman citizens that opposed him. He eliminated the tribunes and the Council of Plebes, which both of those positions are the plebeians. So he essentially eliminated, he hated the plebeians. And he essentially, when he became dictator, he eliminated all plebeian influence that had been achieved at the beginning of the Roman Republic. And he just got rid of it. He also enlarged the Senate. And made it, ensured that it was specifically for patricians. So then in 79 BCE, he declared the Senate restored. Not the Senate restored, the Republic restored. And stepped down from dictatorship. So, I mean, I guess there's that. But the other thing that was a significant consequence, which was one of the ones I listed, was the change in soldiers. Because of this fighting and conflict, Marius and Sulla ended up changing how the Roman soldiers functioned. So how it worked is that the generals no longer had to be loyal to the Senate in many ways. Oops, no, I do not want to do that. Because they're going to raise their own army to the Senate in order to get soldiers or control, and they raised their own army. And so what's going to happen is that they're still all technically considered Roman soldiers, but they're really going to become soldiers of specific generals. So before you had soldiers that were like the farmer soldiers that came into it, and now it shifted to people who were volunteers but got paid. A volunteer army rather than conscripted. And these were people who were urban or rural but no property. So in the past, a lot of soldiers had some property at least. It also became a professional army. You got paid. This was a job. This was your only job. Remember, prior to this old way, you were a farmer first, a soldier when needed. If there was an issue with Rome, you'd be called to fight, and then when the fight was over, you went back to your land and property to farm. You didn't necessarily get paid a lot to be a soldier, and it was for times of need. Now, it was volunteers, and there was a professional army that is what they did. That was their job. They were no longer subject to the state, because the person who they were too is they were loyal to the generals, because the generals paid their money. So it created and often gave incentives through land. But what it did is it created like these mini private armies. And each general had to have their own private army that they funded, whose people were entirely loyal to that general because the generals paid them and made them like them by giving them land and wealth from areas they conquered. The problem is that the Roman army was supposed to obey the Senate. So the Senate would give commands, and then the Roman army would respond to the Senate. Now, there is no Senate involved in the Roman military. I mean, there was a small, but now most of the Roman military was broken into these subsections that were really, like I said, it would be more accurate to call them by the general's army. So Julius Caesar's army, Sulla's army. So they all saw themselves as Roman soldiers, and yet they were fighting for their own interests within these professional armies. And this was specifically changed in order to raise enough of an army to fight each other in the Civil War. So why this is significant, besides you now having a military that is no longer technically loyal or feeling obligated to the Senate, is that it gives future Julius Caesar an idea of how he can essentially control the Senate and make all of the decisions for that. So we'll say Julius Caesar and First Triumvirate. So tri means three. What was learned from this is that if you had the right conditions, that you could make the Senate do whatever you wanted and gain all the power you needed. So the first triumvirate was made up of Gaius Pompey, sometimes also called Pompey in translation. He's called both Pompey and Pompey. Crassus and Caesar, Julius Caesar, right? And there were three components to it. Crassus was the money. The saying was that Crassus owned half of Rome, essentially. Pompey was the you could almost say legitimacy with the Senate, or with more specifically, the patricians. And Caesar was the popular one with the plebeians. They were all patricians, though, and extremely well off. But these are the three conditions, right? If you had aristocratic support, money, and popular support by the plebeians, this meant you could control the government and make them do whatever you wanted. And it worked. They were successful in having power. What it gave was In 73 BCE, Crassus was given a military office. And appointment. And in 70 BCE, Julius Caesar and Gaius Pompey were made consuls, right? Remember, there were 2 consuls. And this is all power. They were essentially between the military appointment and the other 2 being made consuls. You control every aspect about the Roman Republic. They did restore the tribune, so that does get put back in. And the equestrian class does get, some equestrians are then able to join the Senate. So things are going fine. Yay, we have control. We get to do what we want. Things are well. But actually what's going to happen in both triumvirates is that one of them is going to die. And it's always the same guy. Well, not the same person, but the same guy in representation, right? So there is a problem that emerges, which is that Crassus dies. And why that's a problem is because that leaves Caesar and Pompey, and they're going to come to head over conflict. And this fully breaks down with so Caesar had married Pompey's daughter. And this was common. It was done for political alliance. It also kept people in check, right? Less likely to move against him because he was married to his daughter. Well, Pompey's daughter, Caesar's wife, dies in childbirth. And that's going to lead to more problems. The other issue is that the Senate, so what happens with where this goes from this is that you have Caesar, who was in Gaul fighting, and Pompey stayed in Rome. Now, normally you would think that being in Rome, and it's going to work for Octavian, staying in Rome is beneficial for Octavian, but it didn't end up working that way. Caesar ends up getting a lot of the glory because of the military triumph and all of that, where Pompey seems to kind of be diminishing in power, even though many argued Pompey was actually the more powerful guy initially. And the Senate started talking to him and putting in his head that maybe Caesar needed to go. So we're going to watch this quick clip from HBO's Rome. They made 2 seasons. It's really good. It is HBO. So, if you decide to watch it, keep in mind that HBO loves nudity and sex quite a bit, especially in the first couple episodes. Like, they always seem to do that, where it's like, we're going to throw in as much as possible because we're HBO and we can. And then after we get you hooked for the couple episodes, we'll dial it back. But the scenes and the costume settings and all of that is pretty amazing. So we're going to talk about a couple things with this scene when we look at it here.
"400 years after the last king was driven from the city, the Republic of Rome rules many nations, but cannot rule itself. The city is constantly roiled by conflict between the common people and the nobility. Power is shared and order maintained by 2 soldiers, old friends, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus and Gaius Julius Caesar. Once, Pompey was acknowledged by all to be the greater man, but for the last 8 years, while Pompey has kept the peace in Rome, Caesar has waged a war of conquest in Gaul that has made him ever more rich and popular. The balance of power is shifting, and the nobility have grown fearful. Though of noble blood himself, Caesar stands with the common people. A man like that, an aristocrat with soldiers, money, and the love of the people, might make himself king.
Shields on me! Get back in formation, you drunken fool! Reform! Legionary Titus Pullo is a hero of the 13th Legion, but look at him now. Justice knows every man's number. He has committed a terrible sacrilege, and he will pay for it with his life, as will any man here who breaks the law. Brawlers and drunkards will be flogged. Thieves will be strangled. Deserters will be crucified.
Is that it? I was just beginning to enjoy myself.
Before you, Vercingetorix, son of Keltil, chieftain of the tribe of the Averni, commander of the rebel stronghold of Elysia, king of all the Gauls. What would you have of him?
All right, so let's get out of that, and then we'll talk about a couple things with that scene. Okay, so with the video, there's a couple things there, like I said, that I want to address. The first, well, the introduction is just setting up kind of what I talked about with the scene where you have the tensions rising between Caesar and Pompey. But then it shows the soldiers and the fighting style. We'll just put in here with the movie clip. Oops, one. So the Roman military was one of the best in the region, and hopefully you noticed that their style had similarities to the Greek phalanx formation, right? Where you have, they were standing in line, much like the phalanx formation. Now, their shields were more squared, or not squared, rectangle. I know shapes. They're more rectangle in nature than they certainly aren't the round shields of the hoplite soldiers. But and they didn't use spears, so they had the shield and the sword. Those were their main ones, but the formation itself was very, very similar. However, it was definitely more ordered. You saw that the one in charge, he had a whistle, and he would blow the whistle so that they would rotate. So you had rotation on specific time. You had that whistle or command to rotate. And the idea behind that is so it shared the front line. they also held on to a strap to keep everyone in formation. I mean, and to the point of, right, when the one guy, he goes out and breaks formation, they go get him and haul him off, in part because he also hit a commander. And there was severe punishment for breaking the rules, up to death. And so it was, the Roman military life was incredibly strict. As much as it was talking about the lavish spending with Marcus Cato the Elder, the majority of time, especially for the common soldier, was a very strict routine of rules and structure with severe punishment if you broke it. But they had that, like, very this ordered kind of sense of very calm. And it's a good example of just, again, how that kind of formation works. The other army is just all running at them individually. They're standing calmly in line. They're using their shields to block together. And they actually created more formations than just the standard phalanx one. They had really good design for shield blocking in order to prevent attacks. So one of them is that you would have, especially if you were walking up to a group that had a higher position, is that you would have everyone close together with the shields blocking them. Shield walls is what they were called. And then you had another group that would put it on top, right? And this way, if anything was thrown at them, or arrows, when arrows were shot, you had these units that were completely or almost completely protected. So then it shows the military scene. Then the next thing we have with that, it showcases the punishment. And then you have the king of the Gauls surrendering to Caesar, and where they strip him of clothing. And that was something, the king of Gaul surrendering. One of the things that they did with military conquest was definitely this aspect of humiliation. And they would usually parade them in Rome before killing them. And there's a scene later in the show where they do that. Now, not all soldiers, right? But the leaders. So this comes into effect and is going to play a role later when actually Cleopatra knows that this is their MO. And so it's going to impact her decision, what she does when Octavian conquers her. And then lastly, right, you saw the soldiers chanting Caesar's name. And that just reinforces the idea of it being a general's army. So what happens with this is that, where are we at? G here. The tensions increase. The Senate convinces Pompey to try to get rid of Caesar. And so what he does is that the Senate calls Caesar back to Rome. But what he knows is that his consulship was not renewed. Why that's important is that you can't be charged with crimes when you're a consul. And the idea was that when you are consul, that wouldn't be used to blackmail him politically. So he realized, they were hoping he wouldn't realize that they'd send this letter that says, "Hey Caesar, we need you back in Rome," and then he wouldn't realize that they hadn't renewed his consulship. And so Caesar realizes that something's up, and that if they're not going to renew his consulship, that they're probably going to try to remove him. If he went back to Rome without his consulship, they would arrest him and charge him with crimes. This leaves him with two choices, right? That he has to decide. One is you return to Rome based on the order, right? And without the army. And he is not only arrested, but potentially killed, right? That's a maybe, but the arrested was most definitely. Or he returns with his army and challenges their authority. Well, he chooses to return with his army. He asks the soldiers what should they do, what do they want to do, and they support him. So this is going to lead to civil war, although it's not a big one. The famous thing is so he marches on Rome. The famous line is Caesar crossing the Rubicon. And the importance is more symbolic of crossing the river with the army into Rome, marching on Rome, that could make him a traitor because he's the aggressor. And technically, right, he is invading Rome with his soldiers. Well, the thing with marching on Rome is that they weren't prepared for that. So as much as they planned this out, I guess they really thought he was just going to come back. Pompey and senators were not prepared. I can speak here. The senators who were generals that had soldiers, most of them were away. So most soldiers not in Rome. And this leads to the senators and Pompey fleeing, which doesn't look good, that you flee Rome rather than stay to defend it supposedly against this invader. And all that were left supposedly when they arrived were older soldiers and some young boys. So they didn't have much of a fight. In fact, what it really leads to is that they just really walked into Rome without much fight, without much bloodshed, which was good for Caesar, because then he didn't have to fight his way into Rome. And he didn't have to kill a lot of Roman citizens. Instead, he kind of looked like the returning hero who came to set back up after the rest of the senators fled. The other benefit was that in the mess of all of this, the treasury was left behind. It was meant to go with Pompey and the senators, and Caesar ended up with it, which meant that now he had a whole bunch of money to help fund his control. And this meant that with Pompey fleeing, Julius Caesar is the sole ruler in Rome. Now, what Caesar does is, let's put it as a separate thing here. Caesar in Rome. He actually, he does go hunt down and fight a few people, and he does chase down Pompey, but he specifically says he doesn't want people killed, the senators killed, and actually is upset when Pompey is killed in Egypt, which not by him. He also, and this is going to be part of his downfall later, he pardons or forgives all of the senators and says, I want you to come back. You know, we are friends, come back. You know, all is forgiven. The problem is that they had been seeing, they'd been seeing him increasingly act like a king, and in his popularity and the way he acted, and they were concerned that he was taking over power and control. What happens is his actions after this don't dissuade that. Once the Senate comes back and he says he forgives them and they start re-emerging, in 47 BCE, he has them give him dictatorship, which, he says to, save the republic and control order. But then in 44 BCE, he makes them give him dictatorship for life. And this becomes problematic because, of course, one, he forces it. And it wasn't their decision. He makes them do it. And then the whole dictator for life thing, right, seems a lot like a king. And they already had issues with him before that of doing things that could be perceived as acting like a king. He disregarded, so now once he is a dictator for life, he disregarded the Senate constantly. In fact, he openly said at one point that the Senate was pointless. And they don't take too kindly to that. And it also then, it does lead into this idea of suggestion, well, is he a king if he's not using the Senate and he's disregarding them? If he's dictator for life, what's the difference between a king and that? He also did start wearing some clothing that included more purple. And, right, we all know that purple is a symbol of royalty. So the whole, hey, you want to try to not act like a king thing, he kind of just disregarded and was like, I'm good. We'll just, pretend that these are all the things I'm doing. I'm in charge, and I'm going to forget that I shouldn't act like a king because the Romans hate kingship. Then the other thing that led to people disliking him was actually Cleopatra. So dropped the pen on the tablet there. Cleopatra. So when Egypt ends up being a province of Rome, but Cleopatra convinces, when Julius Caesar is in Rome, she ends up convincing him to allow her to remain autonomous as a queen, somewhat like a tributary state. So instead of a complete province where Rome comes in and takes over, Cleopatra still gets to maintain her queenship, and in the process has some independence. The whole story of Cleopatra is super fascinating, and I'm going to talk about it in more detail, where we'll kind of go back and talk about her time with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Octavian. But she convinces him to let her be independent. Eventually they end up in a relationship and they have a child together, Caesarion. He's married to a Roman woman, and the Romans hate Cleopatra, in part because she's a queen. And with her being Egyptian, well, she's Macedonian Greek, but she's the Egyptian pharaoh. She flaunts all of the characteristics of kingship they hate. Absolutely hate. And she exudes all of those things and definitely acted like she was superior to everyone else. And they absolutely hate it. And then he brings her to Rome. So then it's like flaunting your mistress in front of everyone. And when she places his son before him, and he publicly picks him up. Now, why that's important is that Romans had a tradition with children that for sons, if you were going to officially acknowledge that this child was yours, they would be placed before the father, and he would pick him up. So if when the child is placed before the father, if he picks him up, then that father is officially acknowledging that child as officially legally his. So to officially acknowledge your child with Cleopatra was a massive scandal. And then there were questions of, well, is he going to make his son king of Pharaoh of Egypt? And isn't that kingship? And how can he do that, right? So there were all of these issues that just reinforced what they disliked about Caesar. The tradition in Rome for a daughter would be placed before the father again. But instead of picking up, he would instruct her to be fed. So this was done. If this wasn't done, the wife or mother was expected to get rid of the baby. And Romans did have infanticide where they killed. They usually did it through exposure, where they left the babies out in the wild. And sometimes people would pick them up to make them slaves. Others would sometimes save them and put them into their family. And lots of other times they would die. But this was the expectation. So he publicly accepted. He brought Cleopatra to Rome and flaunted her around. He publicly acknowledged his son with her as a legitimate. He still has a Roman wife. He's already being seen as a king-like. All of this reinforces this idea that he had to go. And so the senators end up deciding to kill Caesar. And again, what they use, and this is that common thing again, they needed to save the Republic. But they didn't want to have just one person be responsible, so they decided to have multiple senators do it. The idea being, if that tons of the senators killed Caesar, no one individual would be found guilty. And in the chaos, they may not even be able to know which senators did it. So the idea was to, they distracted Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a very popular soldier and right-hand man to Caesar. And they knew that if Mark Antony was around, he might fight them and cause it to be a problem. So they actually pulled him aside on the way into the Senate Hall. They were going to do it in the Senate Hall. And on the way to the meeting, they pull aside Mark Antony and distract him and close the doors. And then all of the senators that were part of this went up and stabbed him. He was stabbed like 27 times, and apparently he didn't die till the very end. So it was brutal. And they, once they killed once they killed Caesar, they declared Republic restored. And that was their argument and justification for it, is that he was becoming, they said he was a tyrant. He was a tyrant, he was ruining the Republic, he was trying to be king, and it was the only way to restore the Republic. Caesar died because he didn't take into account that in Rome you have to pretend to not be a kingdom. Rome hated kingship, but they were okay with it in the sense of you had to just keep up the facade. The Romans loved the facade. The idea that they still maintained the ideals that we talked about with farmer soldier, duty to Rome, some of the golden shield values, that they were a republic even once they become an empire. As long as you kept up the facade, things were okay. But you didn't break that facade. And Caesar broke that facade. He disregarded the Senate. He openly had a relationship with Cleopatra where he publicly accepted his son in Rome. He forced them to make him dictator of life. He didn't keep up the facade. He was wearing purple. All of these things that didn't keep up the facade, and so people ended up they had to get rid of him. Where his nephew Octavian is going to learn from that. And that's where we're going to end. We'll leave it at that. Octavian was Caesar's nephew. And in his will, Caesar's will, he adopts Octavian. And this is, we'll talk about that next time more, but what it does is it puts Octavian in the forefront. Him and Mark Antony, who thought he was going to kind of be the predecessor, he would succeed Caesar, that he was going, and he's not going to take kindly to the fact that Octavian gets it. And that these two then are going to be the ones that are going to try to run the government together. And then have a civil war over it. Okay, so we'll end there. When we come back, we'll talk about Octavian. And so this really went to just the end of the Republic. Octavian's going to mark the start of the empire when he becomes Augustus. We'll talk about Cleopatra in a little more detail, and we're going to talk about Mark Antony in a little bit more detail as well.